Good morning. We are reviewing the conclusion of Ayin Beis. We're up to page 1421, which we will return to today. And we finished at least that section that we wanted to learn in volume 2, page 972. We basically went from 968 to 972. The topic really begins a little earlier on page 964. Regardless, let me sum up what we learned. And the main reason we went back here is because of the topic of names, Shemus, the names of God, and which originate in the name of God, one single name, what he calls Shemo HaAtzmi, Shemo Bolvad. And a name is the concept of expression, the very expression. And from Atzmu's point of view, there's no need for any expression. It's because he wants it. Now, why does he want it? We don't have a reason. And that's a big part of the discussion here, how that relationship first begins when there is no relationship. There's nothing that exists. So we've been learning is that names give us a good example for what the 10 hidden spheres are, that ein metzias lignuzis, they don't exist actually. They're conceptual. And how does that conceptual sphere, those conceptual concepts, or you could say attributes, that later will become actual attributes. So names, so God created the concept of names, meaning descriptions, expressions. So you think of it in terms of that there was no expression, no definitions, no structure at all. And then God chose to create structure, create expression, and that manifests in the form of a name. So on one hand, it is God's name. On the other hand, the name does not add anything. And it allows for the first step of Atzmus, that's completely beyond definition and beyond expression, to express himself and ultimately have a relationship. So the last piece we learned was how that works. So it's like calling names. That's he says that before you call the name, the entity doesn't exist. Like it is the human example he gave with human name, the names that we use when we call each other, the names when we praise someone and compliment them, to draw out from them from a concealed state their chachma or their chesed, their wisdom, their kindness. And the same thing above, and even deeper, because by God there is nothing before, but the names themselves draw out these attributes. Yeah. And the last piece we learned was that what is the significance of this name, that from which I should add that the 10 hidden spheres are already specific names, and Shmai is only one name. What is that concept of that one name? The very idea, the chkika, the engraving, that Avedus Ha'adam, Halas Man, our work below, should have some value, should be Tefes Mokim, like he said. Excuse me. That Avedus Ha'adam Sheyiyah, just use the exact word. Sheyiyah Tefes Mokim Halas Man. That the Halas Man of our work should be Tefes Mokim. Now remember, there is nothing. We don't exist yet. So all this has to be in God's so-called consciousness, this process. So he says that this Halas Man comes inside the Pshitus. And what does that mean? That specifically because, like the example with water, because water is transparent and does not have any of its own identity, that's why it's a perfect reflector of a face. But at the same time, it remains water. It doesn't become a face. So the same thing, due to the pshitus being that it does not have any shape or form, completely shapeless, that's why the Halas Man is ma'erer. But at the same time, you have to remember that before that, beside the pshitus of Ein Sof, nothing is tefes mokim. And that's why you need, God should envision the chkika, which is the chkika Ein Sof, the Halas Man should be tefes mokim, and that name should be able to draw out those attributes. That's already means that our calling and our avodah is, in a sense, having God respond to that. But how does that first come to play? So he says Because before there was this Siseiris, this Ratzon was all concealed, and the only thing you had was Chafetz Chesed, God's kindness. And that's what he's going to explain the last piece that we learned, that it all originates in a place, because since creation and existence doesn't have any value in God's eyes, it's completely infinitely distant, so then why does it have value? And that's because there's a Chafetz Chesed. That's what he says. So that's the Chafetz Chesed that allows room, Bereishon Menusah de Malka, and that's the Reishon Menusah de Malka in the beginning, where there was the Rishus and Rotzen, meaning before there was that desire to create, first came the Chakik, the Goliv Galifu B'Tirei Allah, that God's Chafetz Chesed, His kindness, in turn, and His love, in turn created the space that there can be a name, Shemo HaGadol, which in turn will allow for there to be a relationship, and Avedas Adam should be Tefes Mokim and have value before God. And this, we all learned this inside. This is called Halo Asman Menei Bey. But before the Halo Asman, before he has Halo Asman, where he's envisioning the tzaddikim who he's going to consult, and the pleasure that he will have from their Aveda. So what gives that any value? And that's the Chafetz Chesed that precedes that envisioning. And that's what he calls the level of and not because it actually has value, but because he desires it out of his love. That's all of Galufa B'Tirei Allah, and he called that Shmei HaGadol, Chafetz Chesed, that precedes everything. That the one who's going to consult, meaning Hashem, precedes everything else, and then everything flows from there. That's the summary of what we learned yesterday. Okay. With that, unless there are any questions, I'm going to go back now to page 1421 in Ayin Beis, volume 3. That's a summary of volume 2. So going back to connecting it to the relevance where we are now, 1421, let's see. So, in this mimer, just tying it all together, he explained the few levels. There's Aleis HaRatzon. That's the place where God already has a desire for existence. That's like Shemus Loshen Rabim that we talked about. There's already a number of names, like he explained on page 1420. Prior to that, there's Kedem Aleis HaRatzon. That's the Shmei HaGadol, I believe he said. The level of Echad. One second, let me just see. Okay. But that's still a gather of Shmei. It's still, in other words, an expression. So there is a gather of Gilui. And then there's the Etzem Ha'oyer HaKol Batz Musei, which he compared to the Koiches Atzmim that are completely encompassed within the Nefesh. And that's the level of Yochid, higher than Echad. And then he finally said something even deeper, that the true Shemo HaAtzmi, more than just Shem Echad, which is higher than the names of the 10 hidden spheres, Shemo HaAtzmi is Kol Batz Musei Mamish, like the Etzem HaNefesh that carries within it, contains within it the faculties, which is higher than the core faculties within the Nefesh, and that's Hayahu Shmei Bolvad, Hu Shmei V'Shmei Hu, and he called that the level of Yechelis, Mashayachalias Mizgala, God's capacity to reveal, which I would say is higher even than what we learned in Ayin Beis Volume 2, because there he went to Shmei HaGadol. He didn't go beyond that. But he did go to the place where the Chafetz Chesed. So it's very possible the Chafetz Chesed, his desire to do good, kindness, love, maybe this level of Shemo HaAtzmi, koich v'yichelis Shemo HaKol ba'atzmusei, and that's the Tachtena Sheba'atzmus. That's not the Ikra of Elikus. She'elim is missing. Okay. So that brings us back to page 1421, and that's where we went over to understand more about the Shemus in volume 2. So, if there are no questions, I'm going to continue now, because this finishes this subject about Shemus, and now he's going to go back to Kol HaMayrich Be'echad. Remember, all this came to explain the Mayrich Be'echad, that when we extend our saying Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, that contemplation, we're basically, the Mayrich is the extended contemplation on what is Echad. How do we find unity and connect to unity in a diverse universe? And that came to explain Ha'ena Amen Yesh Meiraba B'Kol Keiche, that it's Mevatel Kedin Gzar Din. It eliminates any negative things, because you're accessing all the way that highest level of Achdus Hashem, all the way in the levels of Yochid, and even higher, like we just learned, Shmei HaKol Ba'atzmusei. So now he's going to bring that this start of contemplation is, of course, the whole theme here, to be able to us connecting to that. That's ultimately our avodah. Mayrich Be'echad, we do that. So God created existence. We now know the dynamics of this creation, but now we still need to connect to it. We now know just the pieces are in place, but now comes the actual work of us below connecting to this highest levels of unity. And that's what we're going to continue learning now. And that, of course, is going to lead us back to the whole bigger theme of the interface and Torah Eir and the different levels of Avodah. So keep in mind, Shema, of course, is a very operative concept here, because Shema is what leads to V'ahavta Hashem Elokecha b'chol levavcha, which also impacts the animal soul. So it all is going to come together in a beautiful way. And it's ultimately how the Neshama says they're rooted in the highest levels of Ishin Einai, which is God's pupil of his eye, which is higher than Torah and higher than the Malachim and the Einei Ha'eda. But you need those Einei Ha'eda, you need the Torah to illuminate the Neshama, to access these highest levels, which ultimately bring down the deepest levels of unity all the way down into existence. Okay. As I said, I'll stop for a moment if anybody wants any questions, because like I said, we finished a section here, and then we're going to go back now to Mayrich Be'echad. Yeah.
So this is what you said, that the neshama is in this level, right? Which is higher than Yochid even.
He's not said that right now. I said that because I'm bringing together what we learned earlier about the neshamas. It didn't say that right here. But if you go back, you have to go back to the pages earlier where he discussed it, and we'll get back to it a little later. Yeah. You want to look that up? I told you the pages are 1406 is the main place where he begins, but that continues on page 1408. Bunch of different pages that we went through. Okay. Ishanene was on page, we started the whole concept of Veda on page 1408. That's the main place where he began all this in Aveda. And just to give it a little more context, on page 1411, we started speaking about the Aveda of the three levels of Ava. Ava chol levavcha, chol nafshecha, v'chol meidecha, corresponding to Mamala, Seviv, and Atzmus, which is what we're discussing here. Remember, Mamala is the divine within existence that causes a person to want to reveal that divine within us. Seviv is the divine beyond existence, which causes a person halah to be absorbed in the source. And then there's the level of Hu, the highest level of Hu, higher than Seviv, the Hu what he said from the Medrash, the Loshen that Chad Hu, Islan Chad Hu, Tov Mikulan, Hu Hashem Elokeinu b'chol haaretz mishpatov, shemidas racham of le'elam. That's the level of Etzem that has the power to transform the darkness and the gvuras, the kekeden le'gzardin, through amen yesh me'raba b'chol keche, which is where neshama is able to access that highest level. That's what we've been learning, and now we're going back to understand how that works in the actual avodah of it. Yeah.
Is this the darge from Shemo HaAtzmi, or Shemo HaAtzmi is lower?
Which darge?
What you mentioned just now, the highest one, that this is the Kfi shehu ba'atzmo soy.
So all I can do is read from Ayin Beis. He says Shemo HaAtzmi. He connected to Shemo HaAtzmi to Shemo HaAtzmi. It's not Oir, it's Bechinis Yechelis. He did say that on page 1270. And look at page 1407 or 1408. That's what he did say. That Shemo HaAtzmi is Shemo HaAtzmi. And I discussed at length what that means. Shemo HaAtzmi, because he also calls it Eir HaKol B'atzmusei, where we learned here. So which one is it? So clearly there's two levels, and we discussed that. I don't want to go over that right now. The two different ways I explained. Yecholte Lahoyer, Yecholte Shaloi Lahoyer. Yeah. Okay. So the new paragraph on page 1421, pages can be found at ayinbeis.com. He goes like this. Valpi hanal yuvan inyan hamayich be'echad. According to the above, remember the above was all about Shem Oisius. That's all about Oisius, from the word osa, from the word expression, gilui, that this is the place where God first chooses to express himself, and we learn the different levels, Shem, Shmoi, Shem Besloshen Rabim, then the 10 spheres, then later letters if you go from the top down, from Keser, Keches Nalomim, then the letters of Chachma, the letters of Bina, the letters of Machshava, the letters of Dibur. That's from the top down. We discussed it from the bottom up, from Dibur, he went to Machshava, to Bina, and to Chachma, and all the way to Keser, Keches Nalomim, the hidden Keches, and all the way even higher than that, to Etzem HaNefesh. And the same thing, Lamaila. So you have here letters that essentially serve as channels of the flow of divine energy from the highest levels down to the lower levels. So the Mayich Be'echad consists of that contemplation, connecting existence to the letters that created existence, and those letters to the higher level of letters, all the way back, tracing them back to the source. So when God speaks and creates the world with Basara Mamoris Nivra Elam, Dvar Hashem Shamayim Nasu, and he's speaking and creating existence, that speaking, those words, originate all the way from where God first had a chafetz chesed that he desired that Avedas Adam should be Tefes Makim. So everything we've learned, the highest levels, that's where it all begins, or else God wouldn't create existence. However, you still need to go all through all these levels because there's the divine that relates to existence, but it's rooted all the way in this original source. He said he didn't even want to call it a source. It comes from there. He can't call it a direct source because it's not commensurate and proportionate, but it does originate from there. And as such, the Amayich Be'echad is going to be that contemplation from existence all the way back to the highest levels that we've been learning here. That's really the central point, the underlying point of why the Rebbe Rashab elaborated. He wasn't just giving us the dynamics and the mechanics of it. It was for us to be able to connect to this level. So when we contemplate by Hashem Echad, you're thinking not just how existence is coming into being from God's words, but also how it's coming to being from God's etzem into Shemoi, into Oisius, in the highest level of Shemo HaAtzmi, Hakol B'Atzmusei, that God desired. What we learned in volume 2 added the Chafetz Chesed point, which was not mentioned really in volume 3, at least not explicitly in these pages, but he does mention Yecheles, so it all starts from there. So now he's going to explain how all this fits into Amayrik Be'echad, and here's what he says. According to the above, we'll understand the idea of extending the Echad. The Gemara says, Amayrik Be'echad, Ma'irichin LaYama V'Shnesav. The sages teach us the kadam lichte lemailo lemato ledal ruchis suloy tzrichas. That once a person in Shema crowns God as being the Melech, amlichte lemailo lemato, like we say in Shema, Hashem Echad. Echad is what? Aleph of Hashem, and you're connecting it to Ches of Daled, which is the 7 heavens and earth. And the Dalet is the Dal Ruches, the 4 directions, east, west, north, and south. Sulei Tzrichas, that's what you need to do. More than that, you don't need to establish. In other words, that is the parameter of the contemplation of Amayrik Be'echad, of Mechad. V'hainu, the Echad hu shezayin the kim v'aretz. Echad means that the 7 heavens and earth, that's the Ches, the 8. The Dal is Ruches. And the Dal represents the 4 directions. Basically, all of space, all of existence. Not just physical existence, spiritual existence. Says the Dal Ruchas HaElam, B'Telem u'Miyochadim. That they're completely nullified, completely absorbed, and united. So Bitl and Yichur are 2 different levels. Bitl means that it's all Batlan, all encompassed within the source. And Miyuchad means it's all connected, united. Bitl is more of an abnegation, more of an element of stripping us from our identity and becoming absorbed in the divine. Yichud is that our very existence is united with Him, which both are necessary in this process, as we have learned and we shall learn. So he says, V'hu, and how do you come to this level of Amlichte, like he says? Kishi is bainen, when a person contemplates the masha nesavu ribu yischalkus eilimus, that which was created, the many multitudes, the number, the sheer quantity, and the diversity of existence of the worlds, hurak mebchinas esis adibur. So you look at a world; it's a very big world. It has 8 billion people. It has billions, trillions of different entities, species, each species filled with its own diversity. I mean, just think of the universe, how big it is, how vast it is, and how diverse it is. But the contemplation begins to recognize all this comes from simply God speaking. And I go back to Tanya, chapter 20 and 21, and those chapters where he talks about Dibur, and he discusses exactly this, that the Dibur is, everything begins with God speaking. So imagine, here I am speaking to you. Imagine that my speech creates literally trillions and trillions and trillions and zillions of different creations. So that's the first step in Achdus, that you're taking all of existence in all its details and it's all its complexity and retracing it back to Dvar Hashem. It all begins with Bereshis bara Elokim es Hashemayim v'sa'aretz, Vayomer Elokim yehi oir, vayi oir, Vayomer Elokim yehi rakia, vayi rakia. And the same thing through all the 10. And as the Alter Rebbe explains in Sheikhud V'Amunah, those 10 statements encompass all the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, which in turn break down each of the words into Chilufim and Trumuris and Gematrias. So all the permutations and all the different ways that we break down those letters create all of existence. So that's the first step in these bandhus, connecting existence with its divine energy within it. It's like think of a computer program, not looking at the results, but looking at the program looking at the results that you get on your smartphone or on your computer is all driven by a programming language. So you're connecting the product with the producer in the context of Esis Adibur. And and we now see, and we see. Lamata, we see below, she'esis hadibur nichlolim be'esis hamachshava. Now we go to the next step. Dibur doesn't begin on its own. Before you speak, you think. So your thoughts define and dictate what you're going to say. So the same thing, Lamaila, Hashem made it again. God didn't need to make it this way, but He wants us to understand His process and also for us to retrace the steps. So now we have stepping stones. We start with Dibur, God's words that create existence, and now we realize that it's really all encompassed first in letters of thought. Like we learned earlier, the letters of thought, however, are much more sublime. We don't hear those letters. Another cannot perceive or discern these letters. Before the letters came in speech, were expressed in speech, they were first in thought. And in thought, they're not a mitzias like the mitzias adibur. There are, of course, exist, but they don't have any tangible expression. Speech, you hear my letters, you hear the words, there's a real expression. In thought, you don't have that mitzias. And this is now referring to where we began this discussion on page 1417. If you go back there, you'll see he spoke about this in detail, the difference between thought and speech. The lower part of the page. That speech is sensed by another, the letters are tangible. In thought, you don't have that. So it's not b'mitzias, relatively speaking. V'hein sham, and the letters there are b'chinas bittel, b'skal is b'esis hamachshava. So the letters of speech, before they actually are expressed through words of speech, they are encompassed within the letters of thought. That's step 2. Now he's going to go to step 3. Ve'esis hamachshava nichlolim be'etzem hanefesh. He's doing this very briefly because the truth is, machshava earlier we learned is nichlal in pnimius haseichel, which was bina, and then he went from bina to chachma, and from chachma to koiches nalomim and keser, rotzen and tainug, and then he went to etzem hanefesh. Here he's going just to sum up because he's relying that we learned it already. So he says, now these letters are nichlal be'etzem hanefesh shesham b'chinas achdus gomel. Now how these letters of thought are encompassed back in the core soul, there is complete achdus. So here we have the speech. I'm talking even on a human level. I'm speaking right now to you. These words are not disconnected from my thoughts. They originate in thought. The thoughts are not disconnected. They originate in the etzem hanefesh, as we learned. There's no oisi is there, tangible ones, but it's rooted there, and there everything is seamless and achdus. So here you have the ma'irich be'echad, that you're contemplating on existence. Again, an existence that's vast in every possible way. Marabu masach Hashem, in quantity and quality, vast and diverse in all its details. You're reconnecting that to its program, if you want, the source code, the letters, the divine letters, which in turn connect you back to God's thought, which connect you back to God's etzem, as we've been learning. So all this is the contemplation of Amayrik Be'echad. So this was the example. I already said the nimshal. He's going to now say the nimshal. This was the mashal. That even when a human person speaks, like he says, Anuroyim lamata. So first he began with lamata, we see. So the letters of speech are encompassed letters of thought, the letters of thought and etzem hanefesh. V'kachal derech mashal lahavdil avdolas ein kates. And so too, as an example, with a clear qualification of a separation and distinction. Lahavdil avdolas ein kates means not just to be mavdil and separate between us and God, but ein kates. The separations are without an end. So as much as we have in common, and this is a mashal that works, we have to always qualify that it's very different above, like we've been discussing. The mashal always has its limitations. And that's also part of the mashal, to understand how it is by us, say similarly by God, with a qualification that God is completely in a different level of all of this. First and foremost, because God didn't have to do this. In our case, there's no way you could speak there's no way you can express your etzem hanefesh without thought and speech. With God, you could have said that from the etzem, he could have just created existence. So that's the first major distinction. And nevertheless, because he created it in a way that makes sense to us and relates to us, we can't talk about the mashal to give us to illuminate for us some of the processes that God used in creation. So he says, "Kachal derech mashal havdil havdalah sein kates yuvan lamaila." So the way it is lamata, from there we can understand how it is lamaila by God, by Hashem. The mashanesava elam is b'chinas mitzias or b'chinas ribui. That the fact that existence was created in a substantial way, that we have a existence of substance, and b'chinas ribui, meaning in a state of diversity and ribui multiplicity or multitudes, zeh b'chinas esis dibra elyon. All that comes from the letters of the supernal speech of God. The esis eli nichlolim be'esis hamachshava, and these letters are encompassed in the letters of thought. And these letters of thought are encompassed. In other words, they originate from the letters of Shemo HaGadol, the great name that we spoke about all the way in the highest levels. The Shom b'chinas Achdus Gomer, and there's complete Achdus. Remember what we learned in volume 2? It's like water. Even when the face is reflected there, because Hashem wants that because of His love, Chefetz Chesed, it still remains pshittus. That means it's ultimately achdus. So even though when it comes down into lower levels, it manifests in real existence, the truth is our entire existence, if you're able to trace it back to the source, how does God see it? It's all part of God's unity. It's only that He explains in Tanya, and we will explain later here, is the tzimtzum that doesn't let us see that. That's why we see the diversity of existence. But remember, we're talking here Avodah Sa'adam. Our Avodah is to retrace the steps and remove that concealment. So we should be able to contemplate and see the unity that lies within all this diversity. That's the whole purpose of this Avodah. If you didn't do Hamayrik Be'echad, if you didn't say Shema Yisrael, yeah, we'd be in a world with many heavens, like he says, 7 heavens and earth, 4 different directions, and then you break it down to all the multitude of existence. So the Ma'arich Be'echad, our contemplation, our Avodah, is to reconnect, is connect the dots and reconnect them back to the highest levels of Achdus and Shmei HaGadol, where it's Achdus Gomer, like he said. So before I continue, let me stop here for any questions.
It looks like he answered the question that came up yesterday as far as how does he know?
How does who know?
How does the Rebbe Rashab know what it's like up there?
I believe I answered. I mean, that's the whole point of Chassidus is ultimately a Gili Elikus, that the Alter Rebbe didn't just sit down and innovate ideas. It was essentially divine revelation that was shining through him, and the same with all the Rabbeim.
Right, but yesterday the answer was, the Rebbe knew because he's a Rebbe. But here he's saying, I know because that's how it is down here.
That's not enough. We know many things down here. How do we know that it's up there that way? That had to be revealed, that God said, not necessarily. That itself is a chiddush of the Alter Rebbe. What you're saying, you're just saying it easily because once it was told to us, we know it. But how do we know that that everything in our existence reflects on Atzmus? You could say that God is removed from the whole picture, and He's only giving us a small sense of Himself. Bottom line is, you do need to say that it wasn't just deduced by a logical process, just like Matan Torah. By Matan Torah, of course, once it's given to us, we can explain it, and there's plenty of understanding in it. But at the end of the day, it is Torah that's coming from above, that's being given to us. And there was indeed resistance to that, because before the Alter Rebbe, all the Gedolei Yisrael did not think of this. They didn't understand this. Why the Alter Rebbe Dafke? Why the Chassidus Chabad? Anyway, I don't want to digress. That's more of another discussion. But any questions on this that we're learning here?
The Rambam is saying expression, ilu yedativ heyisiv. If I would know would be him, I would be him. The
It's
Rebbe
not the
Rashab,
Rambam, by the way, but okay, yeah, the Chayk Yisrael say it.
the Rebbe Rashab expressed himself one time, yedativ heyisiv. The expression means I know him, I am him.
Well, let me say this. I'd be, before we get there, he didn't come to contradict the fact that it says in the pasuk that God said, "No one can see me and live." So we have to keep in mind, like he's saying here, at the end of the day, we are not God. We are able to connect ourselves and sublimate ourselves and contemplate on this achdus and reach high levels. That's the whole purpose of what we're learning. But we have to also remember there is a distinction. And what you're quoting is very high level of Aveda. And ultimately, yes, it says when Mashiach comes, it says, "V'lo yilamdu oid isha sre'eyu, ki kulam yedi esi miktanim v'agdela." One person will not teach another because everyone will know God, esi, from young to old. And yet there's ktanim v'agdela. We also learn v'lo yikonef oid merecha v'hoye enecha reis es merecha, that the garments and the levushim that today we need in order to be able to see the divine, because it's too intense for us to be able to contain, those garments will be, so will be removed and we'll be able to see v'nigla kved Hashem. So the divine reality will become more revealed all the way to the highest levels. Now, how much revealed, that's already each person according to their level. So I would just make this very clear. Bottom line is, as I said a number of times, to really appreciate all this, not just on a mechanical level or a mathematical level, where like you think you know the map, that this is here and that's there and so on and so forth, is to personalize this in our Aveda. You have to come back and say, okay, I learned this in Chassidus and Ayin Beis. What does this mean to me right now? Where am I? How much am I experiencing godliness in my life? We definitely have here a blueprint. We've definitely been given a picture of what things are like all the way before the Tzimtzum, all the way to the closest that he was able to get to Shemo HaAtzmi, or what he called Chafetz Chesed, Shemo HaGadol, Shemo Kol Batzmusei, all the different names. But what does it mean to you? How does that manifest in your life? Because frankly, for many of us, simply going through today and just instead of being distracted by this material world and recognizing it was created by Dvar Hashem is already a great achievement. Imagine that today your entire day focus is the words of God that create existence. If you were able to do that, I would say you've reached a tremendous high level in Avodah. We're not even talking about Machshava and Etzem HaNefesh and all the way to Shemo HaGadol. Just simply, instead of focusing on the world as an end in itself, which is what most of us are distracted with, Chassidus is teaching us to focus on the divine energy within. So you're going to eat breakfast or lunch or dinner. So don't just focus on the food. Focus on Lo Yalechem Levade Yichya Adam. Not on bread alone does a person live, but I'll keep Meitzi Pi Hashem Yichya. On the words of God, on the expression of God, Meitzi Pi Hashem. Literally these things. God's words, HaMeitzi Lechem Mina Aretz. That is quite a level for many people. Now, is that the end of the process? Obviously not. That's the Ma'arich Be'echad. But I think if you really want to live this, and I would say to understand it even, you have to find a way to personalize it and customize it to where you're at. It's not a contradiction to what we're learning here, these highest levels. But now comes the next step. Because it's easy to just talk about, okay, I'm one with God, I'm one with Shemo HaGadol, that's it, Atzmus, this. But you know what? Mashiach is not here yet, and we don't have the Beis HaMikdash HaShlishi, and we don't have Gilead L'Kuz Be'elam Hazeh. We still have violence, and we have deaths, and we have plenty of problems in our lives. So clearly, even though we're at the threshold and we have to just open our eyes, but there's work to be done in opening our eyes. So at the same time that we're learning all these levels, we have to also see how does this now integrated in where we are. And that, I think, is always important to remind ourselves. So the Rebbe Rashab doesn't say this because he realized that when we learn it, we'll understand this on our own. He's just telling us the levels. And he's obviously there and sharing with us. So it's a gift that we're getting to get a picture of what all these levels are. But now comes the more difficult part is internalizing it. So I just thought, time to time, more than time to remind us of this. So it's not in any way diminishing our efforts in understanding this. It's more just internalizing it and customizing it. Okay. Any other questions about what we learned? Because he's going to continue now in this contemplation of Amayich be'Echad. So now he continues. He says, "Ube'emes," and in truth, "Kamoisha Shmei HaGadol hu b'chinas achdus." So he's adding now a point. He said, okay, we went from Eishis HaDibur, meaning the letters that God spoke, that from creation, the creation has traced its way back to the source code in God's speech, which in turn traced it back to thought, back to Shmei HaGadol, where everything is unified. Now the question is, does that unity permeate all these levels? So he says, Be'emes, just as Shmei HaGadol, which is his great name, that first place where God said, I want to be expressed, and there's completely him. There is nothing that exists. We learned earlier, Chafetz Chesed, or Shmei HaGadol is just the mere fact that he wants to express himself. It's all about God wanting to express himself. So there's no other, even though it's going to create names that an other can call him by those names, that itself all originates from Shmei HaGadol, the Shmei Kol Batzmusei, that God wants to express himself. So he says, just like there's Achdus there, Kain, Mamish, who gam b'chinas esis hadibra elyon. That Mamish is also how it is in the esis of Dibra Elyon. That same level of seamless unity also is really in Dibra Elyon. Shein gam ke b'chinas achdus gmura Mamish. They too are utterly united. Now this you could say is quite a chiddush, because you could say, you know what? That level of achdus is reserved only for Atzmos, because he's one that sees the whole process from the top down. So he sees that all of existence is only my speech, which is really only my Shmei HaGadol, because I wanted to express myself. But can we achieve that? When we look at the Dibur, we see Asara Mamoris Nivra Elam. Yehi Eir is not Yehi Rakia. It's different words. When you look in the Torah, when Hashem says, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, and then he says, La Yilacha, and then he speaks about every word, every letter in Torah is a separate word. So I understand from the point of view of the author, he sees one picture, one seamless picture. It's all his expression. But from our perspective, when we're contemplating on it, so we're going from the bottom up. Yes, we can understand God's perspective, perhaps to some extent, but is that same level of Achdus experienced also in the Esis HaDibur? Or is the Esis HaDibur the divine that's diminished and tailored to existence? So here he's clearly saying that since there's only one Hashem Echad, that Echad doesn't just mean Achdus and Shmei HaGadol, that Achdus is also there in the letters themselves. So bottom line is, the letters, like when you look at the letters on a page that the author wrote, even though they are separate letters, but they carry in them the same seamless unity as they were in the deepest levels of the author when he first conceived, and even earlier when he first desired to express himself. So this is an important statement, which he's of course now going to explain in more detail. But that's the statement he just made.
Is that why it's so important that every letter in the Torah has to be complete? That cannot be, is it imbued with that unity?
You could say that, yes. Yes, you could say that. Not only every letter, and also you need all the letters.
Mm-hmm.
Not just, yes, every letter is critical, and you need them all. It's like nothing is indispensable. They're all indispensable, all part of that one unified picture, yeah.
How could it be otherwise, Rabbi? Obviously, it's an important concept. It's beautiful, and the notion that it's essentially everything.
It could be otherwise that God could say, we could say that God's unity can never be perceived by us. We can only perceive it only as like the sum of the parts, so to speak, but never the full seamlessness in Atzmos, in Shemo HaAtzmi. It could have been that way. You could have, and some, as a matter of fact, before Chassidus Chabad, some Kabbalim said we can never really access that level of unity. Not that it isn't that way. Obviously, from God's point of view, it's that way. The question is, can we access that Achdus through the existence and through Dibur? So the truth is, yeah, he just said, Be'emes, that's that way. The question, however, is there something that we can relate to? Because, it's like saying, can you really connect to the etzem of another person? Or ultimately you connect, so to speak, to his, as much, just his etzem as it's expressed to some extent. So it's, you could explain it in several different, you could explain it in many different ways, But we'll see how it goes. I mean, he's ultimately, this contemplation definitely makes sense. Because what you're essentially saying is that he just said be'emes, Achdus and Shmei HaGadol is also the Achdus Gemura in Dibur. Now, when I read it, I see the Chiddush in it, so to speak. You could read it without saying there's a Chiddush. You could just say he's making it clear that Achdus is a seamless Achdus as it goes through the whole of Ashtalshlos. But it's going to be very relevant because, especially when you look in Tanya and then later in Ayin Beis, the end of the Ayin Beis that we're going to come to, where we finally come to a point where that the tzimtzumim are only from our point of view, that before God there is no tzimtzum, and that we can access that is a big statement, because you could argue that the tzimtzum is the cutoff point. We can reach the highest levels of the divine, but before the tzimtzum, lo yahaya nesinis mokum le'elamis klal. So yes, God wanted existence, He wants a relationship, but once you get before the tzimtzum, now it's only on God's terms. We no longer can enter with our own identities. But based on what we're going to be learning, it's clear that we could. Now, when I say our identities, it doesn't mean our identities as they are right now, where we have egos. We're going to have to obviously strip ourselves from any sense of self. But it means we don't get completely annihilated because we are rooted there. But that's part of the whole hisbonenus, what that means. How do we exist, so to speak, before the tzimtzum, when we can't exist before the tzimtzum, because nothing can exist in that presence of divine energy. But that's what Avodah accomplishes. That's a big, big part of the theme of Ayin Beis, that our Avodah has the ability to transform the tzimtzum, because the very tzimtzum was meant to be a root, to be a catalyst, a stepping stone toward Gilui. Tzimtzum is not a black hole, basically a dead end. The tzimtzum's purpose is to be megal. Just like when a teacher is mitzamtzim, diminishes and channels his ideas, it's not meant to conceal, it's ultimately meant to reveal. But that revelations take, as I said, step-by-step process, because it takes time for the student to absorb and assimilate all these ideas.
But how is it possible that we can absorb that energy if the whole thing says that we cannot absorb it? I mean,
Well, so let's go back to the simple example. That's like saying a 5-year-old will say to you, how do you expect me to ever become a tremendous scholar? I'm only 5 years old. And the answer is you keep learning. And from 5, you'll become 6. And then 6 will become 7. And you'll learn more. And you'll absorb more. Your containers will expand. And yes, a 5-year-old little infant can become the Alter Rebbe. And, could become a tremendous... So saying the same thing. That when he was 5 years old, no one could have predicted. You never could imagine, how could a person come to such levels? So we have all of life as examples for that, where we begin in the beginning, we begin on a very basic level. Like, same idea. A child is conceived, one cell. How could one cell become 75 trillion cells with the whole complexity of a human being and all its life? Just as an example. So you see from that there's a process going on. And because God embedded into existence divine elements, his divine speech, and created the human being in the divine image, so we're not just working with our own tools, we're also working with divine tools. In Tanya, he goes on in chapter 23 to explain that that's where Torah and Mitzvahs comes into play, because on our own, we can't have a full experience of the divine. But God gave us His Torah, and He gave us His mitzvahs. And remember, Ner Mitzvah Torah, which is going to be a central theme, even though the Ayin Beis never gets back to it, but it's a big part of this whole discussion that the neshama is not alone. The neshama is living in a dark world like the eye, and outside light shines for us. So we have resources that help us reach these higher levels, and it's a constant journey, and it's a journey that because God imbued, because He wanted a relationship with us, like we learned in Ayin Beis in Volume 2 the past few days, because of that, He created a situation where we could have a relationship with Him. Even though initially you could say there's no value of existence compared to God, is completely, infinitely apart, but His chafetz chesed, His love, in turn created a series of expressions, starting with Shemo HaAtzmi, where He's giving us a taste of Himself. He's expressing His etzem. That's exactly what we're learning here.
No,
There's a process called avodah. This is called the work we do of refining ourselves to be able to reach higher states of consciousness and awareness. And we have, it's a long journey, and it's an infinite journey.
I understand, Rabbi. I guess what I meant was, you're saying that we're going to be able to sustain this in a way that is different from the way it was at Matan Torah, that you're saying they couldn't absorb.
Remember I said before, we can't understand this until you personalize it. All you have to ask yourself is not about Matan Torah. Can you refine yourself from yesterday to today to be more, assimilate more godliness within your life?
Okay,
That's all that matters. That's the only thing you can do. The Matan Torah part is that's theoretical, frankly. You need to see how you grow, and your growth relative to you is like Matan Torah compared to yesterday. So it's all about where you are. The fact that we can grow and become more godly and less egocentric and less arrogant and less fearful, whereas we become more godly, that's the key thing to all of this. It's a journey for each one of us. Relative to each one of us, we have these levels. We say every day, we'll say, B'chol levavcha, b'chol nafshecha, b'chol moedecha. Right there, we have every day 3 levels of godly love, of loving God. Now, overall, yes, after thousands of years of galus and mesiras nefesh and sacrifice and good deeds, the world has become refined collectively. Our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents paved the way, so we can now come to a point where we can achieve levels of higher revelation than anyone before. And ultimately, when Mashiach comes, we'll be able to absorb it in ways that was unprecedented. That's correct. Now, how do you explain that? That's what I said. That's why it has to be looked at relatively where you are. And then there's levels that, you ask yourself, what will you be like if Mashiach comes today? What type of consciousness and awareness are you going to have of godliness? It's a very good question. That's an answer that each of us has to struggle with, and each of us has to come to an answer based on where you are right now. That will answer the question. The more you've learned Chassidus and the more you've integrated these ideas now, when Mashiach comes, the more you'll be a keli, a container for achieving these higher levels. And it's all going to be relative. Like I said, Mektanim v'agdelim, even though all will know God, you won't need a teacher, it still says there's the distinction of Chotn and Gadol, of a younger, a smaller, and a higher level.
Thank you. That's beautiful. Thank you so much.
Any other questions? Because I think I'll stop here. Okay, so the next section is going to explain how this Achdus from Shemo HaGadol is exactly the same level of Achdus in the Isis HaDibur. That's going to be the next section. And all this, again, is going to come to explain Kol HaMayrich BeEchad, which will then take us back to Amen Yesh Me'Rabba B'chol Koichei. And then this is going to take us back to the 3 levels of Ava, of love, and then finally back to Ishenenai, Yisrael, and Torah, Yisrael as being the pupil of the eye, and Malachim just being the eyes, Eini Hashem. And how they interact with each other, because the neshamas below need that outside light as a siyua to help them be able to see. Just giving you the lay of the land where we're going here. And this is all going to lead us back all the way to Hamakbi L'Sheves, the Maimer, which comes back to Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam, Ner Mitzvah, Tere'er. And I will connect, and I will try to explain how it all gets connected. And then, of course, the main thing is to go back and see how this Hemshech would have concluded had the Rebbe Rashab continued writing based on the Maimorim, especially on Magbil Shevet, which is a Chanukah Maimer, coming to Chanukah, so it's very fitting. So we'll stop here on page 1421.
Rabbi, I have a question.
Around halfway down. Yeah.
I debated whether to ask before or after the corner, but I'll let you decide. But I always am extremely reluctant to bring up material from outside Ayin Beis, but in this case, I can't help but ask this question. I'm reading another mimer by the Rebbe Rashab by Daita. I'm sure you know it. And I'm not finished with it, but among other things, it essentially is saying, it's a theme we've talked about in Ayin Beis quite a bit, that the Shem Havaya and Shem Elohim are essentially sourced in Atzmos, and so and the Shem Elohim is not really it's not really hiding or just dispensing away of Elokus. It's just a concealment. It's just it's origin of the Shemo HaAtzmi, and Shem Havaya is the Ein Sof. And the whole notion that everything, even the concealments, even all the hiskafas, all the separate parts of the lower worlds, ultimately are manifestations of Atzmos. So that's a very macroscopic approach to understanding that even in the darkness, whatever we see is still Atzmos. Okay, now we approach in that mimer. He approaches that concept in the macroscopic sense. He doesn't go into issues of oisias at all. But nevertheless, here he does. Well, you wind up at the same place, which is that and he talks about how can it be that Shem Havai and Shem Elohim, the Gilui and Helam, all come from the same Etzem. It's one Echad. He talks about it's all Echad. So ultimately, he brings that back to the same place he comes here. I guess what I'm asking is like, what do you need oisias for if you understand what I just said? And then why say it? You understand? They both get you to the same place, but I'm just trying to understand why you need the oisios to get there, because he did it in the other mimer. He does it without any. I mean, yes, he does it with oisios. Sorry, that terrible pun. But he doesn't go into this degree of detail.
Well, you learned one mimer via Daita, but there's another 100 mimarim that I could refer you to that also talk about this topic, and each one emphasizes different points. It's all a part of a bigger picture. You can't talk about everything everywhere. Shar Yochad V'Amuna, which is maybe the first of all places in Chassidus that talks about Bitla Elamis and Havayu Elakim. I don't know if you've learned Shar Yochad V'Amuna in Tanya. There absolutely uses Oisius and Dibur. Chapter 20 and 21 and 20, it talks about Oisius and Dibur. So there's some places where it's a major theme, and some places that's not necessarily the thing he needs to emphasize. So Chassidus is a very rich and wide topic. It says the expression is Aniyim b'makom echad, Ashirim b'makom acher. So when you learn it all of it together adds up to a very grand picture. And different Maimorim focus on different details. It's not you can't necessarily read into it. In addition, the Maimer you're referring to, Tafresh Nun Zayin, you're talking about from the Rebbe Rashab.
Yeah.
So in addition, that Maimer has its particular message that he wants to give. It's a short Maimer relatively compared to here. In volume 2, actually, in Ayin Beis, probably before you joined, there's a whole discussion that's very similar to V'yadaita, Tafresh Nun Zayin, where he talks about Havayu Lakim. He actually talks about that pasuk, V'yadaita Ayin.
Yeah, no, I was part of the class at that time.
Yeah, so that's in volume 2. You'll find many parallels between that Maimer In Ayin Beis, which is of course the magnum opus, that's it's the 1470 some pages. There's details that you're not going to find in other Maimarim at all. And yet, you could ask a question. 1 second, I learned you can learn a short Maimer, a Chanukah Maimer this week, and say, hey, I got the whole picture of Achdus Hashem. Why do I need to learn 1470 pages of Ayin Beis? The answer is, it's a very big picture, and if you want the full picture, you need to learn it all. And every Maimer has its focus and emphases, and that's the bottom line. So it's like saying, if we learn about interface, Atzilus is an interface. So why do we have to learn that Kesser is an interface? And why is Ak an interface? And what's Lifnei Tzimtzum? Why do we need to go Lifnei Tzimtzum? We could understand all this before without Shemo HaGadol, and without Yechelas HaAtzmus, and without Eira Kol Ba'atzmusei. The answer is each piece is relevant, and you need to have the whole full picture, and every part adds another aspect to it. If you want to go down, break it down further, you can go and explain at length what the Oisi's come to add. At the end of the day, the letters are Mamala Kalalman, and it's the divine as it's experienced within relates to existence. And then these letters all the way are rooted in the highest levels. So there's also distinctions between V'yadaita, Tafresh Zayin, and Ayin Beis. There, in other words, besides the fact that different Ma'amarim focusing on different points, there's also some things that are said here that are not said there, and very likely the other way around as well. So that's a general way to look at it.
Thank you. That was beautiful. Thank you. Appreciate that. It's kind of like looking at a microscope, for example. You see a cell, but then you can look in the cell. You can look with how they look at atoms or whatever. There's an electron microscope. That's the word I'm looking for. So you got a regular microscope, you got an electron microscope. You're still looking at the same thing, but you gain different knowledge by looking at each.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
And I'll add one more thing, which is really an aside, so not so relevant to our discussion here. The Rebbe has a beautiful talk that he gave on Yutas Kislev, Tafshin Chav Ches. That would be 1967, end of 1967, where he explains the difference in Tanya, chapters 20 and 21, where he talks about how letters are encompassed in the source, and in the Shayachad V'Amunah, he talks about how light, like the sunlight, is encompassed in the sun, in the source of the sun. What's the difference between those two Mishalim? So there's also, in other words, in the levels of Achdus, there's connecting the diversity of existence to the letters of God that created existence, and then there's connecting the letters of God that created existence to the source of those letters, and then there's connecting Atzilus, like connecting the light itself, expression of the divine, to the divine. So you're talking about different parts of the map, all of them with the focus of trying to find the seamless unity. So it's also critical to keep in mind, what level of unity are we talking about? Are we connecting existence to its source? Are we connecting the source to a higher level of the source? Are we connecting the highest level, the expression, to Atzmos itself? So like we've discussed, there's many different ways where these interfaces come into play.
Beautiful.
Very
nice.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Well, since we're using human examples, when you start studying human anatomy or even neurology and other complex parts of scientific, the biological makeup of the human being, it's fascinating because in the beginning you start seeing certain internal structures, and then you realize that within that internal structure there's yet another structure, and yet another structure. So when you really start looking at it, you start saying, wow, it's not just a skeleton. It's not just that there are neurons in the brain. Each neuron is itself made up of all kinds of piece parts. And you keep going more and more, like when we speak about the elements and the molecules and the atoms and subatomic particles. So someone will say, well, I thought I figured it out. I know you figured out one aspect. And then when you go deeper, you start seeing within that itself, there's there's Uris and Kalim. But then in the Ur, you'll find the Kali. And in the Kali, you'll find an Ur, subtly speaking. So
Yeah,
it's a constant
100%.
microcosm, macrocosm, and like a hologram type of picture,
Beautiful.
where every detail has within it all the infinite details. It's like they say, the atom, even though the illustration of an atom that we have looks like a bunch of grapes, is not based on any reality. No one ever saw atoms in that way. It's just a working diagram. But when they study the process of atoms, what it came down to is that it works exactly like the star systems. So suddenly in the microcosm, the microcosm is working with the same type of structures as the very solar system. And you see this constantly, which is itself amazing. It's like a hologram. They find like sometimes in a seed of a flower, you'll see the same patterns as the flower as it grows into a big flower. The patterns continue to repeat themselves. I forgot what it's called. Yeah. Okay. So we're stopping here, middle of page 1421.